I would like to have you meet a gentleman who's been doing these marvelous orchestrations for me, Mr. Quincy Jones. Right there. Bill Quincy Jones.
Here we go, everyone. Come on. Don't care if you dance as we celebrate Quincy. Let's go.
One thing I knew, I wanted Quincy involved.
Hello?
He's the master orchestrator. He had the respect of every musician on the planet.
It's a whole vibe, everyone. Everybody, come on. Everybody take it to the top. Sing it on. That's right.